I think it's important to say, particularly for the audience that you will be writing for, that this is a massive change from where President Bush was. President Bush was saying that US emissions would carry on rising up to 2025, and President Obama is saying that he's going to cut US emissions. I want them to do the US to do as much as it possibly can, consistent with getting a bill through the Senate. I think the finance point you make is important. These are some of the discussions that are obviously going on in these negotiations about what we can do on finance. In my view, it is important that this agreement comes out with more than fast start finance. Fast start finance is important, but as Douglas would know better than I do, that the needs of adaptation, the needs in terms of deforestation and countering deforestation, the needs in terms of mitigation for developing countries are enormous, and if we want an agreement that has everyone in it together, then we need to put finance on the table. So I think finance beyond Fast Start, including from the United States, is an important part of this agreement that we need in the next few days.
I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, my sense is long-term and predictable financing is what the developing world wants and needs, and in that sense, important though the contribution of Fast Start is to making progress, it's also important to recognise that if you are looking to move your economy onto a low-carbon path, then you need a degree of predictability looking to the future. But I think there's also a prior political question which sits below these negotiations, which is there a will to find an agreement that is ambitious, effective and fair? And I would echo the endorsement that Ed has offered to the change that has taken place in the United States with the new administration. My sense is there is a genuine desire to be deal makers and not deal breakers, but there is a great deal more negotiation to be done in the days ahead.
Holly Williams, Sky News. Yesterday you said to me that time is running out and we're 5 seconds to midnight. Which, in your view, is worse, getting a deal that isn't good enough, or putting things off for 6 months, 12 months, maybe even years?
I mean, Holly, I don't really like either choice, I would say. I think, look, what I would say about this is that this is not just about getting any old deal, and it is really important to say that. We want an ambitious outcome that respects and understands the science, and the truth is that the politics is behind the science. I think the politics has done some catching up in the last year, but there is a long way to go for the politics to catch up with the science. I have to say, though, I don't think that Plan B is a good option at all. In other words, putting it off I don't think is an answer, because as I was saying to someone last night, this isn't going to get any easier. The truth is that actually I think while this feels incredibly difficult, and it is incredibly difficult, the truth is that in a sense the stars are aligned in a way that makes this actually the most propitious time for an agreement. We have a new American president, we have a global movement on this issue that has meant in part that 130 leaders will be coming here, and we have a situation where the world is watching climate change in a way that I don't think it's ever done before, and indeed watching events at Copenhagen. That's why we have to go all out to get the best agreement that we can. That's not about getting any agreement, but it's about getting the best agreement that we can, consistent with the science, in the coming days.
Yeah.
Juliet Eilprin, The Washington Post. I was hoping to ask you a question about, you mentioned obviously verification as well as the importance of binding commitments. Given how things are developing, to what extent could verification even be more important than getting, say, developing countries who have expressed some resistance of going beyond the Bali text to agree to making things binding? Could you talk a little about, what matters in the end in terms of producing reductions in emissions?
You're saying in terms of whether countries stand behind their commitments or
Right.
or MRV?
Yeah, exactly. Given that these are both contentious issues in the deal, can you see a way forward that what matters is verifying that these what they promise to do domestically is done, as opposed to the idea of getting language that's beyond what's in Bali, which clearly seems to be an issue for a lot of these countries?
I mean, just one thing to say on this is that we have moved, and it's important to sort of not just bank the movement that's taken place and sort of forget about it. We have moved on some of these questions. So, for example, at the moment we have national communications which are issued by all countries. at the moment, they are extremely infrequent in terms of what certainly some developing countries provide, because there's no obligation. I think there is a real willingness among leading developing countries to make national communications forward-looking. So in other words, they're not just reporting on previous actions, but they're reporting on plans to make them much more regular. So India, for example, has said they should be they could be every couple of years. So just on your question about countries sort of kind of setting out commitments and standing behind them, I think we're making progress. I think it's also important to say, without becoming too sort of theological about this, that the Convention is very clear on this, that all countries will take mitigation actions. So in some sense, the very fact that countries are willing to say we're going to provide national communications with details of what we're going to do, and the nature of the Convention, means in some sense countries are bound to do those actions. Now, we think it's important that countries set out in the agreement what they're planning to do, particularly leading developing countries, so that people can see transparently, I beg your pardon, what China, the United States, Europe is planning to do. On your question about MRV, I do think that's an important part of this story, because I think it's important that everyone knows that not only are countries committing to do things, but that there is some sense of verification that they are doing them.
Yeah.
Nick Rigillo from DPA, the German press agency. You started by listing a series of obstacles that we face and saying leaders, it shouldn't be all left to leaders to sort out. Can you perhaps elaborate on what you environment ministers can decide and what you can't? For example, on finance, we know that leaders ultimately have control on the public finances. But for example, on emission targets, is this something that you environment ministers may be able to decide? Thanks.
I mean, I think that we should decide as much as possible, frankly, because I think leaving this to the last minute has always been something. I think it's partly an inevitability in these negotiations, but I think it's also a worry. So I think we should move on as much as possible. And you say sort of finance. I mean, leaders can be in contact with their environment ministers and representatives here. They don't need to be here for countries to move their positions. I think we should move forward as much as we can. And I also think that if there are issues left outstanding, they need to be a very small, limited number of issues. I think there is a real danger, as I said earlier, in having a whole slew of issues. So that's why people have to move from their entrenched positions, and that's why we have to have a process of, at the very least, narrowing down the difficult issues and deciding on some things, overcoming some obstacles. And I think that's what the presidency is working towards. Yeah.
Jared Wynn from Reuters. You said that there needs to be more than just fast-track funding agreed here. Would you like to see something specific in terms of what developed countries are going to offer in the mid-term?
So we've said three things. We've said that the UK will make its contribution to Fast Start. We've also said that we think that the needs of countering deforestation are an essential part of any agreement, and the Prime Minister has set out financing needs for 2010 to 2015 for forest countries, which I think is a figure that partly comes out of the informal working group on these questions, which was set up in April. And we've also said, and the Prime Minister was the first person to do this, that we need a long-term financial figure. So we've said $100 billion a year, public and private finance, by 2020. It should be a working figure for these negotiations. We think it's important to try and get movement on all these fronts as part of the negotiation.
I would just echo what Ed said. I mean, it was Gordon Brown who was first to put those numbers on the table, and the fact that he identified a per annum number for 2020 indicates the conversations that he, Ed and I have had with leaders in the developing world who are clear that they would want to see not simply immediate action in terms of the Fast Start announcement that's been made, but also a recognition of the need for them to be able to make decisions based on predictable financing through into the future. But it is the very stuff of the negotiations that will be undertaken in the days ahead to see what progress we can make on these issues. In terms of the British commitment, we have been clear both in terms of the Fast Start money that we want the world to provide. The European Union commitment was confirmed at the European Council, and a British contribution has been made to that. So I think on a range of these issues we have been clear that Britain has a role to play, but it is important that others do so in the days ahead.
Okay, we've got time for a few more questions, but we're going to turn into pumpkins at 10 o'clock apparently. They'll throw us out of the room. John Vidal.
John Vidal, Guardian. Can you, on the peaking issue, do you understand why the developing countries are loath to sign up to limiting their emissions or peaking their emissions by 2020? They say that they are going to be prevented from growth. Do you understand that?
We're not asking developing countries to necessarily peak by 2020. What we have said all along in these negotiations is that we need a global peak, which is a slightly distinctive concept, by 2020. Why is that so important, John? It's important for developing and developed countries because the truth is that unless we get global peaking by at least by the latest 2020, we are going to find that we are in the business of runaway climate change. And that's what all the science tells us, that that's the latest point when we should have global peaking. That is a very important name for these negotiations. Andy.
Andy Revkin, New York Times. Given what would have to happen to have a world heading toward 9 billion people decarbonize, do you think there's adequate attention given in this treaty process to money for basic research and technology advancement, not just deployment?
I think you make an important point. Douglas said that where there is a will, there is a way. Tony Blair has said, partly because of the reports he's done on technology throughout these negotiations, that where there's a way, there's a will. And you have to show that we can move on these technological questions. I actually think there's been lots of good work done in the negotiations on technology. There's been good cooperation in the Major Economies Forum. But I take your point that global R&D expenditure on technology is a very important part of this. Countries do need to move forward on that. We also need to find ways in which there is finance, frankly, available for technological development in these negotiations. That is an important part of what we set out as the 2020 needs number. For example, helping to develop CCS in developing countries. Yeah, Ben. Sorry,
Ben Jackson from The Sun. Ministers, can I ask you, given your words about all the stars being in alignment and this being a very auspicious time for getting everything done, do you feel that the 100 billion, if that is not achieved, and long-term finance isn't settled, that you'll be left with a cop-out at Copenhagen?
I think long-term finance is a very important part of this agreement, and we are negotiating hard to get agreements to finance in this. It is very difficult for various countries in this process to commit a long way out for a whole range of reasons, but we think finance is a very, very important part of any agreement.
I would just add, Fast Start's also important because it evidences the commitment of the developed world to support the developing world, and in that sense Ed is right. We have both been leading and negotiating in terms of Fast Start funding for before 2013 and working to secure agreement for the post-2013 framework.
Marcus Hoy from BNA in Washington. Can you just summarise where the existing funding for the Fast Start is coming from, how much new money is available, and also is there a chance that the UK could up its contribution here in Copenhagen if others did the same?
Well, let me deal with this issue directly. There is existing commitments which have been made by the British Government, which form part of the announcement that the Prime Minister made at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. We have been clear that there needs to be extra cash, additional financing post-2013, but significant amounts of money are already available which have both poverty reduction and climate adaptation benefits. Ed and I saw for ourselves recently in Bangladesh the work that is being done there on the chores, the sandbanks, to lift those households which are presently vulnerable to flooding. That clearly has adaptation benefits but also poverty reduction benefits. So we are clear that there needs to be resource committed pre-2013. We have set out how we will achieve that in terms of the figures that the Prime Minister used as recently as the European Council at the weekend, but we are also clear that there does need to be additional financing as part of the agreement post-2013.
Yeah.
Murray Griffin from Carbon and Environment Daily. You talked about the need for public and private finance. Do you think enough attention is being paid here to how to mobilise private finance? And what would you like to see happen on that front?
We think the role of the global carbon market is very important in this process. And actually one of the reasons why we need more ambition, for example, from the European Union, is it will make for greater flows of private finance as part of moving to more stringent targets. There is a lot of work going on in this as part of an agreement. In fact, we have a whole team of people who I met, who I was meeting yesterday, talking about what they're doing in this area. So I think there is attention to this. I understand the wishes of developing countries that you need public finance as well, but I also think that private finance can play a very important part in this agreement. This lady at the front who's had her hand up for a long time.
Vanya Walkerly, Malta Business Weekly. Todd Stern, in his press briefing on Friday, rejected out of hand the LCA chairman's text on mitigation. How will this help contribute to a successful outcome?
I think that the concern about some parts of that text is that it needs to reflect the fact that developing and developed countries both need to take action. I don't speak for Todd Stern in this process. I think that we can make progress on the basis of that text, but clearly there'll be some amendments to it. Anyone else? Last question. Yeah, David. We'll get you a microphone.
David Derbyshire, the Daily Mail. Is the fact that the Prime Minister's coming out early a sign that the divisions between developed and developing countries are so severe that they're putting the successful outcome in doubt?
I think it's a sign of the seriousness with which he takes this issue, and I think it is a sign that the negotiations are moving too slowly. And my very clear message today at this press conference is that negotiators and ministers need to get their act together, because leaders are starting to be on their way, including our Prime Minister. He, I think, can play a very important role in brokering and overcoming some of the key difficult issues. I've always said, as I said earlier, that leaders have a very important role in this. But frankly, it's also up to negotiators and ministers not to leave everything to the leaders, but to get their act together. And that's what we need to do today and in the coming days.
Could I just add, I spoke to Prime Minister Meles of Ethiopia, who will be here representing the African Union, and he was keen for the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, to play a central role in these negotiations. They worked together on the Commission for Africa in 2005, and in terms, he urged the active engagement of Gordon Brown. He paid tribute to the leadership that Gordon Brown had shown back in June by trying to move the negotiations at that point from words to numbers. So I think the fact the Prime Minister is travelling here tomorrow will be welcomed by many in the developing world who recognise that there continue to be divides that need to be bridged in the hours and the days ahead. We can get an agreement here in Copenhagen. The question is whether we will get an agreement, and it is therefore welcome that the Prime Minister is committing time and energy to something as vital to Britain's future as these negotiations in the days ahead.
Thank you very much, everyone.